elves in fantasy, legendarily beautiful creatures with sharp faces, long, lithe limbs, and androgynous features. Some settings see elves as immortal beings, or long-lived in the extreme, and yet maintaining a form of perfection all that time, over hundreds of years. Other settings position elves as delicate, changeable fey beings, whose whims and forms are as fluid as the water, whose moods and tastes change like the seasons. Both of these interpretations, I feel, fail to capture the nature of a society whose participants live in fairly small, self-selecting and unchanging social circles for hundreds of years, because suggesting that elves are a platonic ideal of themselves forever, or that they regularly shift from delicate androgynous blonde to delicate androgynous ginger when autumn comes, feels a bit flat. Fat elves, thin elves, muscular elves, bald elves, tattooed and pierced elves, and honestly, elves who aren't all wearing the same or very, very similar styles of clothing as every other elf in their society for years and years and years on end. All of these could, would, and should exist in any reasonably designed elfin society, and I intend to prove it. I want to talk fashion. It's a human concept, to be sure, but the outward demonstration of social status using one's own body, clothes, accessories, hairstyle, lifestyle, and consumption habits would, I feel it fair to say, be a cornerstone of any society that has any conception of social hierarchy, or indeed any concept of personal property. Essentially, if a setting's elves aren't perfect communist hippies, then they are affected by questions of class, wealth, and authority. They need leaders, they need labourers, they need supervisors. And this necessitates a hierarchy of power if they're going to cooperate in any sort of civic project, or indeed in any military sense. And perhaps your setting's elves share some sort of hive ancestral mind that ties them into a broader space in a social project with no feelings of jealousy, no need for an authority figure, because each elf works in unison, making everything better for everyone. In that case, sure, but I've not seen too many representations of elves that lean that way. For every other kind of elfin society, one of the easiest ways to identify a leader, from a distance perhaps, or to a visiting delegation, some foreign person or power, is to give them a particular article of clothing, a particular outward appearance, or something else to signal their office. Now, again, it must be stressed, elves aren't human. Their lives operate on timescales, usually that we can barely comprehend. They are very often portrayed as slaves to tradition, and fervent upholders of ancient laws, pacts, and customs. But any society that has that much respect for its own cultural history will tend to develop its own shorthand for those historical roles over time. Record keeper, keeper of law, keeper of the law. These are all roles that are very significant in a society that respects its own traditions to that extent. They all need marks or badges of office. A circlet turns to a crown befits a sceptre, and all of a sudden you have a royal court. A group of high-ranking, high-esteemed peoples who are vying for attention and interest and benefits for themselves and their people from the higher up, the grand authority. And a brilliant way to do that is to evoke the authority, to follow the trends that they set out, either in manner, in dress, in speech, or bring new fashions to court from elsewhere. But how does all of this lead to elves having generous proportions? Sure, they might have a variety of clothing options to signal status, or perhaps to be fashionable. But surely body shape and body composition isn't going to be a fashion statement in elfin society. Firstly, it must be noted that in every society we've ever seen, body ideals are important. Now, it is possible that elves who are constantly changing and shifting their forms may have less of a tie to a specific body that they count as theirs, but it is also true that the ability to choose or in somehow shape your own form the next time you transition to something else is going to lead to a concentration around a certain cultural perception of what an elf could or should be. In other words, trends in body image. Now, if we're talking male body image throughout history, generally, the ideal man is also an ideal warrior, essentially big, imposing, and muscly. On a broad sense, being very slight or very small is generally seen as detrimental in most historic societies. But the soldiers of history did not look like modern bodybuilders. It's just that most warriors were taller than the average man, and usually had some extra meat on their bones. They weren't chiseled. If anything, there was a little bit of fat on most historic soldiers, because you don't just need energy stores for long endurance-based campaigns. It's also beneficial in a fight, generally, to be slightly heavier. Up to a point, larger size and larger body mass is beneficial in a martial conflict. Chiseled muscles were just not on display for warriors of the past. Yet idealized statues of said warriors often remove a lot of that fat and focus very much on the chiseled, broad-shouldered ideal. Bodybuilding is not a practical mean to gain either strength or combat prowess. But throughout history, many societies have found that look to be ideal. Heck, if we look to 16th and 17th century Europe, the bombast was in fashion. It's a garment stuffed with malleable materials, generally worn on the upper half of one's torso to pad out clothing that you were wearing, making you look like you had broader shoulders, bigger musculature, and a larger chest. It was essentially male padding to accentuate and suggest the ideal form, even when the wearer did not have such a form. Men and women have historically, in different eras, worn different sorts of padding on shoulders, chests, abdomens, thighs, buttocks, and even calves, specifically to accentuate or create features which were considered desirable for their age. We've been doing this for hundreds of years because body shape and body composition are significant parts of fashion. They're just harder to change. It's harder to morph your body into something that is fashionable, and so padding exists as a way to fill that gap. Quite literally. So if our changeable elves have some sort of ideal form of the male or female or the elfin body more generally, perhaps more androgynously, it makes sense that they would change their bodies to fit that ideal. And if our immortal, unchanging elves are able to alter the composition of their body through exercise, then a lifelong project may be undertaken. Who knows? The thing is, the ideal body is not static. It is tied to cultural and social factors. And the ideal body has, at various times throughout history, required a little extra weight, especially when it comes to the female form. Societies around the world through history sometimes find themselves celebrating plumper forms. This is partly because of the generally true assumption that a woman with some extra weight must, throughout history generally, be fairly well off, as she has not had to work and starve herself to the bone in order to put food on the table. Generally, in a pre-modern world, having fat on one's body implies that someone was well-fed and had leisure time. And frankly, being well-fed and having leisure time are aspirational qualities in any era, so body ideals tend to develop accordingly. We want to be like those people who are living the best lives. And those people living the best lives are not toiling in fields until the sun goes down and then toiling over household tasks until sleep takes them. So why are elves nearly universally skinny as a rake? It doesn't make a great deal of sense. Surely, over the millennia that they live, there must be some times where some elves have significant leisure time, have nothing to do, and have an abundance of food. And no need to burn off those calories. In a meta sense, probably part of the reason that we only see skinny elves is the fact that the entire history of the fantasy genre sits within an era of human history where diet culture has also existed. Not only existed, but existed as a commercially viable product to be sold. This is certainly in place by the 1920s, and it's not exactly let up its grip on society today. But if you're really, really looking for reasons for all your elves to be skinny, there are a few. It could be a genetic factor, some metabolic superpower, or a very low threshold for hunger satiation. It could also be part of elves' immortality, that they can, only be killed by a blade or something like that, that magically they essentially don't need food, or require some very different form of sustenance than the rest of us mortals. Or perhaps it's simply the fact that they maintain the metabolism that we get in teenage years throughout their entire life. Perhaps elfin food doesn't feature very many calories, but leads you to very quickly feel full, like a few bites of lembas bread. Or perhaps even their leisure activities force all elfin lifestyle to be unilaterally strenuous and tiring, making it really quite hard to build fat. Perhaps an elf's environment has some impact magically on their body type if we're talking the changeable type of elves. Wood elves may end up very lithe indeed, with longer arms perhaps for swinging through trees like apes, while high elves building spiralling cities outside of nature may tend stockier and stronger, suited to building or other manual labour. Or perhaps the answer is just magic. Either shape-changing magic, which forces them all towards an ideal form. All elves look the same because they're all chasing an idealised version, a platonic ideal of elf, just like we discussed with our six-pack warrior statues earlier. Or perhaps most elves use illusion magic to mask their forms and turn themselves into this ideal elf, despite the fact that they've been sitting munching away at fruits and snacks while writing their novel for the last 10 years. These are all possible, plausible, and to some extent reasonable. And any combination of any of these could work as an explanation for your world's skinny elves. But I ask you, are any of these factors stopping every single elf in your setting from presenting themselves in any distinctive way? Perhaps there's a single elfin diplomat drawn in by the tasty, fatty, carby food of the nation which they find themselves doing their diplomatic work in. Or maybe a great elfin king so disillusioned with his life's work that he sits in his chambers for days on end just eating so that he can feel something. To suggest that no elf in a fantasy world has ever broken with a traditionally acceptable elfin body shape is a strange hill to die on. I think the better question is, if we're going for a species of skinny, lithe, tall people, is why would a little bit of roundness around the hips be an incredible social taboo to a massive, massive extent, if it does sometimes tend to happen when an elf eats too much foreign food or goes into a Great Depression. Because remember, it's those with the greatest privilege and power in society who end up usually being trendsetters. And it's so often these people who have the highest chance of eating lots of calories and gaining some weight. This is, of course, historically before the rise of very, very cheap, ultra-processed foods. Are the physical trappings of comfort and privilege so unsightly to elves that they gather together as a people to oust and cut down those who seem to dine and sup on that privilege? Potentially. But that's a very interesting, very dark take on a very revolutionary morality within elfin society. And one more thing. Elves live for hundreds or thousands of years. Do you really mean to tell me that none of them, not one, has a midlife crisis, develops some body dysmorphia, or goes through a serious injury with a long recovery time of requiring inactivity, food and rest? Or hell, an elf has a serious real dwarven ale phase that lasts for 100 years. Throughout our lives, our levels of fitness, fat distribution, strength and body type change on many, many occasions. Often without our even changing anything. With hundreds of years, in a small closed community that breeds very slowly indeed, some elves will seek to differentiate themselves from others, unless that society is strictly and harshly punishing those who break the mould, in which case you're going to have a revolution. Elves may differentiate themselves by seeking contact with other cultures and species. Or perhaps they simply adopt a countercultural stance, like seeking out piercings, other forms of body modification, tattoos, or even just wearing some human fashion as a statement. Because even if we see elves as the ultimate isolates, keeping their noses out of everyone's business, it's strange to imagine that an elfin society wouldn't want to at least be forewarned of any threat to its existence. In fact, if you're a culture trying to be left alone, it's often in your best interests to form relationships with nearby regional powers, and to make your continued existence valuable to them. This means diplomats, delegations, and the odd gift, likely part of a gift exchange, not always necessarily in the form of objects, but perhaps the exchange of ideas, cultures, recipes, things like that. Heck, in many fantasy worlds, elves tend to be genetically compatible with other humanoid peoples. Even if we have elves that have an intense, natural, biological and magical resistance to change. Whether that's an entrenched culture, whether that is a certain aesthetic of elfin heroism that pervades culture, whether that is a really strict and authoritarian regime, or a cultural notion of idealised elf that is a very specific and attainable goal, or just having very picky taste buds and stomachs. Half-elves might not have those problems. And those who have experienced and lived in other cultures are often ambassadors for said cultures across both. They lead to synthesis, they lead to intermingling of ideas, and often that leads to the betterment of all peoples. What I really want to stress and leave you with is not a specific aesthetic sensibility, a specific body shape or hair cut or hair colour or a body modification that is more or less likely for an elf to have. What I want to stress is that elfin culture may not be a monolith. In fact, it is very unlikely that elfin culture is one thing. And no matter who you are, trends and preferences do change over time. Elves may well seek to maintain their traditional construction methods, but if their blades are breaking on the blades of their enemies, they're going to need to learn some new techniques, either new magical techniques to strengthen their tools, or smithing techniques. Adaptation is necessary for the survival of a species. Not just in an evolutionary sense, but in a sense of adapting one's ideas and magic to new threats and new situations. We see that trends and preferences change all the time in our own society. Just look at the idealised form for a woman in 1925 and 2025. It could well be that elfin culture in your specific fantasy work is at an exact point in time, undergoing a return to their roots style cultural revolution, where communitarian, natural and traditional values triumph as a broader part of society and everyone's wearing flower crowns. You could say that the traditional way that elves are depicted is the cultural moment that is happening in elfin society right now. But remember that that is a choice. It is a choice to set elves in this stage, this era of a culture. even if their culture moves glacially. It's a choice not to explore the phase in Elven culture, perhaps, where everyone decided the draconic language was an even fancier form of speech and so started learning it among high echelons, which trickled down, and now they're using some draconic import words. Or perhaps the time where hobbit or halfling waistcoat stylings swept through elfin society, everyone wearing their own versions of elfin waistcoats. Or even a time where everything's going really quite well, a time of plenty, where the royal court just so happens to be getting a bit rotund. And that, as a trend, becomes ideal, becomes interesting for those few 100 years, for those 40 years, for those 3 years. And it becomes a feature of the long tapestry of the history of development of society. Even if these times were in the past, you may see an old holdout still going around in his waistcoat, using draconisms. And I think that a little bit of diversity, intrigue, and the intermingling of culture just makes everything far more interesting. So that's my argument. I hope it is taken in the spirit that it is meant. I'm not advocating for or against including or not including certain features of things in your world. I want it to be a conscious choice. I want us to actually think about the realities of social construction and how those things might influence the past and the future of a society as it grows and shifts. Because they do. Even the stoic, perfect elves who are the same from age 20 until their death a millennium later are going to have phases of interest, phases of something, phases where outside factors influence their reality. And those are going to show marks in the culture, especially a culture like Elves, which lives for so long, for many years to come. You may see multiple eras of fashions included in the same group of elves simply because some are 300 years older than the others. Or you may not. You may choose another path. But know that it's a choice. With all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.